Welcome to News Breakdown. With the 2016 US presidential election hotting up, it's no surprise that slavery is a hot topic. Bernie Sanders has been talking about slavery during his election campaign. In this video, we'll be looking at families of famous individuals that benefited directly from the slave trade. First up is Anderson Cooper. Anderson Cooper is connected in a familiar way to slavery. His bloodline is tied to the Vanderbilts, one of the richest families in American history. Cooper's great-great-grandfather, Cornelius Vanderbilt, who was also Cooper's cousin through inbreeding, was a tycoon who built his wealth from shipping and railroads. He also owned plantations. One in particular was in Georgetown, South Carolina, where Michelle Obama's ancestor Jim Robinson, who was born a slave in 1850, worked. Next on the list is David Cameron. The family of the current Prime Minister of Great Britain benefited from the enslavement of African people. According to Dr. Nick Draper of the University College of London, as many as 1/5 of the wealthy Victorian Britons inherited part or all of their fortunes from the slave economy. As a result, there are now wealthy families all around the UK still indirectly enjoying proceeds of the slavery they actually inherited. In addition to benefiting from the slavery whilst it was legal in the British Empire, Cameron's ancestors were given £4,101, equal to £3 million in today's money, or $4.7 million for the 202 black people they enslaved on the Grange Sugar Estate in Jamaica. Next up is Paula Deen. Paula Deen is an American celebrity chef and cooking show television host. On an episode of NBC's Who Do You Think You Are?, Paula Deen discovered that her ancestor John Bates, who was a slave owner. Dean, who was also born and raised and lives in Georgia, found that Bates, a politician and plantation owner, was very wealthy and hefty portions of his assets were slaves. Dean went on to say, "I've said so many times that my family was never involved in slavery in any way." Dean also said, adding, "It's horrific and it's sad to know." Next up is Rick Warren, better known as Pastor Rick Warren. The celebrity pastor Rick Warren encountered the sins and triumphs of his fathers when he sat down with the Harvard history professor Henry Louis Gates Jr. for a PBS episode of Finding Your Roots. Warren, who founded the 20,000-member Saddleback Church in Lake Forest, California, was stunned to learn that his third great-grandfather owned slaves in Alabama. Next up on the list is George W. Bush and George H.W. Bush. According to researchers, a notoriously vicious slave trader who brought captive slaves from West Africa to colonial America is the same man whose descendants produced two US presidents, George W. Bush and his father, George H.W. Bush. According to Slate.com, 12 American presidents owned slaves, 8 while serving in the office, and at least 25 presidents count slave owners among their ancestors. But Thomas Walker, a direct ancestor of George W. and George H.W. Bush, was part of a much more appalling group. Thomas Walker was a notorious slave trader active in the 18th century along the coast of West Africa. Walker, George H.W. Bush, Bush's great-great-great-grandfather, was the captain, master of, or investor in at least 11 slaving voyages in West Africa between 1784 and 1792. In the late 18th century and early 19th centuries, at least 5 Walker family households, George W. Bush's ancestors by his father's mothers, owned slaves in Maryland, Cecil County. Next up is Richard Dawkins. Dawkins is an outspoken atheist who once branded the Catholic Church as an evil. Is the direct descendant of Henry Dawkins, who owned 1,013 slaves in Jamaica until he died in 1744. According to the UK-based Daily Mail, Dawkins' 400-acre family estate over Norton Park near Chipping Norton, Oxfordshire, is believed to have been bought with the money made through slave ownership hundreds of years ago. Next up is Reba Mcentire. Reba Mcentire is able to trace her ancestral roots back several centuries in America and England. She discovered aspects of her family background that pained her greatly on the NBC documentary series Who Do You Think You Are?, including the fact that one of her great-grandfathers was a slave owner. Last but not least is John McCain, who perhaps is most famous as President Obama's opponent in the 2008 presidential election. What is not well known about Mr. McCain is that his ancestors owned about 120 slaves before the end of the American Civil War. A Wall Street Journal article states that whilst the descendants of Mccain's, who was his great-great-grandfather, inherited and still own 1,500 acres of the original plantation land. Finally, we have the current US President, Barack Obama. According to research by the Baltimore Sun, one of Obama's ancestors, George Washington, overall owned over 2 slaves who were recorded in the 1850 census of the Nelson County, Kentucky. The same records indicate that another Obama's ancestors, Mary Duvall, also owned 2 slaves. Please note, I decided to add President Obama on this list despite the fact that he's not white. I made this decision based on the fact that the president's mother's ancestors owned slaves. Thanks for watching. Please leave your comments below and subscribe to the channel.